Welcome, everybody. Nice to see lots of friends and new faces as well out there today. I'm Daniel Ziblatt. I'm the director of the Center for European Studies, and this event is part of a series that we've had running this semester, Questions of Fascism and Democracy, that I've been co-chairing with Peter Gordon. We've had a really busy semester, both in terms of real-world material and lectures. I just want to very briefly note that we have one more event in this series. Evgeny Finkel, so professor of political science at Johns Hopkins, will be coming next week in a discussion of his new book, Intent to Destroy: Russia's 200-Year Quest to Dominate Ukraine. And Harvard's own Serhiy Plokhy, the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute, will be discussing. So that should be a very good event as well. And I want to turn to today's event. Very excited to have a discussion of this new book, Assault on the State, by Stephen Hansen and Jeffrey Kopstein. The book's actually in such high demand that you can't get your hands on it, except for me, but go out and order it.
In another week.
In another week, yeah, okay. So, every once in a while, a book comes along that kind of captures the zeitgeist, and I think this book has done that. It came out in 2024, so I'd say it's a new book, but it came out last summer. But suddenly in 2025, with Elon Musk and Doge and so on, events caught up with the book's diagnosis. Many, of course, have recognized for a long time that the Trump phenomena and Trumpism, Trump administration is a threat to democracy. But this book also helps us see another threat, the threat to government and the state itself. And this book puts that dynamic into kind of broader perspective. So we're going to proceed today with a 20-minute presentation, is that right, from the two authors, and then we'll have discussion, comments from our two discussants, 10 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor, and I'll be chairing the discussion. So let me just say a word about the authors and the discussants. So Stephen Hansen is the Letty Pate Evans Professor in the Department of Government at William and Mary. He served as the Vice Provost. He received his BA in Social Studies from Harvard a ways back, and his PhD in Political Science from UC Berkeley. And he was a visiting scholar here at the Center for European Studies in 2022, 2023. It seems like a lot of the stuff we've been, a lot of great work gets done when people are visiting scholars. So you were working on this, beginning to work on this, I think. So Hansen's also the author of several very important books: Post-Imperial Democracies, Ideology and Party Formation in Third Republic France, Weimar Germany, and Post-Soviet Russia. That's a 2010 Cambridge book. And Time and Revolution, Marxism and the Design of Soviet Institutions, and many other important works. But I'll make one little note here because I think it's important to understand partly where this book comes from. Back in 2008, Steve served on a team lead. I didn't realize this, just reading your biography, of the Russian Domestic Politics Group for the Obama for America 2008 Foreign Policy Advisory Group. And the reason that's important is that Steve's a longtime observer of Russian politics and really a leading authority on Russian politics in the United States. Jeffrey Kopstein is Dean's Professor of Political Science at UC Irvine. Like Steve, Jeff received his PhD at UC Berkeley in Political Science, where he wrote his first book on the demise of East Germany, entitled The Politics of Economic Decline in East Germany, 1945 to 1989. And I should note, he also wrote that book, I think, partly while here back in the 1990s on a postdoc. So as center director, I have to point these things out. More recently, Professor Kopstein's work has focused on interethnic violence, voting patterns of minority groups, anti-Semitism, anti-liberal tendencies in civil society. And before the assault on the state, his latest books are Intimate Violence, Anti-Jewish Pogroms on the Eve of the Holocaust, a 2018 book with his co-author Jason Wittenberg. And then most recently, Politics, Memory, and Violence, The New Social Science of the Holocaust, a 2023 book. So if Steve's one of the leading authorities on Russian politics, I think Jeff is one of our leading scholars in Eastern and Central European politics. So it's really wonderful to have you both here at the center. Now, much briefer word on our discussants, because a lot of people know our discussants. We draw on local talent for our discussants. Can't really think of two better discussants to discuss this work. Our first is Theda Skocpol, the Victor Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology here at Harvard. She's the author of many groundbreaking works, including The Classic States and Social Revolutions in 1979, Protecting Soldiers and Mothers, 1992, a more recent work on the Tea Party and the remaking of American conservatism, Rust Belt Blues, Why Working Class Voters Are Turning Away from the Democratic Party, and one particularly significant work For today's discussions, back in 1985, Theda spearheaded a major project entitled Bringing the State Back In, which did exactly just that, brought the study of the state back into the study of comparative politics. So in light of today's discussion, I think that will be very interesting. And then finally, our second discussant is Steve Levitsky, the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government and Director of the Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies here at Harvard, leading scholar of authoritarianism and democracy, the author of many works, including Competitive Authoritarianism, Revolution and Dictatorship, the Violent Origins of Durable Authoritarianism, and he also has now dabbled in American politics as well with How Democracies Die, co-written with me, and Tyranny of the Minority. I've never introduced somebody who referred to my own work. But anyway, it's so the way we'll proceed.
And Berkeley grad.
And a Berkeley grad, yes, and a Berkeley grad. Yeah, so the way we'll proceed, 20-minute presentation from the authors, 10 minutes from Theda, 10 minutes from Steve, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So thank you and welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thanks to everybody for coming. It's really an honor. Just to be sure you got this right, I was the team lead for Russian domestic politics for the Obama.
What did I say?
It just sounded like domestic politics, like I was running the Chicago team in general.
Yeah.
So it was a little less grand, but happy to play the role anyway. The origins of this project really come out of Jeff and my friendship and a collaboration that goes back now nearly 4 decades. As we get older, it's weird to say that. But we met at UC Berkeley in grad school, and we're both specialists on countries that don't exist anymore. I in the Soviet Union, Jeff on East Germany. So I think early on we got interested in states that don't exist and how they come and they go. So we were kind of thinking, like many of us in the room during COVID, when you were in that crazy period, looking at your screen, what's the project that can keep us sane? And Jeff and I started sharing texts and the like about the weird phenomenon, not just in the United States, but across the developed world, that nobody could come up with a public health policy that everyone would agree to. And this is separate from which one you like or don't like, just to not go there. Whether, you're anti-vax, pro-vax, anti-mask, pro-mask. It's just weird that public health authorities were unable to come up with anything that didn't become immediately politicized and polarizing. And we said, this is weird on the health level, but it's also just strange on the state level. Why? We know there's distrust of the state in many countries, but why are we at a point where people don't trust basic medical science and the administrations of experts that states have built up over the course of decades, even in countries like the United States or the UK, where you would have expected really consensus? I mean, the National Health Service is a treasure of the UK, and yet still the same debates, the same kinds of problems. And so we decided that that was really a puzzle to unravel, which is, why is there this assault on the state itself? Why don't people want the state, given what it's accomplished? And we saw this, if you look in the book, we talk a lot about this. The whole notion of a deep state, right, has become our substitute for a serious intellectual or public discussion of what states do. It turns out that the origins of the term the deep state come really on the political left, not on the political right. It was originally a concept that made a fair amount of sense in Turkey in 1996. It came to light because there was a car crash unexpectedly where a fancy car was carrying a member of the Interior Ministry of Turkey, a centrist member of parliament, and a notorious gangster and his girlfriend, those 4 people. They smashed into a truck, or a truck smashed into them, and they lost their lives. But in the trunk, there were ammunition, there were fake passports, there were all sorts of things that would help the parliament guy and the underworld boss and the Interior Ministry collaborate on doing things like, taking on the Kurds or Islamist groups or anyone else that was challenging the Turkish state. And so the idea of a deep state arose because there really was one. I mean, why on earth is the government and the parliament and the underworld bosses all working together in this crazy scheme? And then that migrated to places like Egypt or places like Iran, where you could also see similar forms of shadowy collaboration of authoritarian regimes with their security services or their militaries to work with gangsters and the like. Then it kind of took on a new life in the US when left-wing critics, people like Edward Snowden are a good example, who began to see the surveillance state and the military-industrial complex in sort of the same light and said, well, it's not just places like Egypt or Turkey with dictatorship, it's actually the United States that has a deep state. Still on the left, mostly people on the left criticizing the military-industrial complex. But from there, very strangely, with people like Steve Bannon being a leading figure, it makes one more jump, and that's to the political right, where suddenly the deep state becomes an equivalent of the administrative state. It's essentially now a catch-all term for the state itself, for the modern state. And I think most people today who use the term deep state have no idea that it comes from this kind of genealogy, but it's migrated not only in the US, but to countries as diverse as the UK, where Boris Johnson at one point blamed his end of his tenure on the deep state of Brussels. And Netanyahu now uses deep state all the time to talk about his efforts to get control of the judiciary, and Jeff will say more about that. So, here we are in this book saying we need to defend the modern state. It may, raise the question, why do that? I think these days we're getting less pushback than we did last fall when we started this set of presentations. But it is, of course, a question, right? People don't like states typically. In academia, there's been a lot of critique. States are seen as, mostly entities with coercive powers or surveillance powers. And we could talk more about what the state actually does, but first we should talk about what the alternative is. A key reason to defend the modern state is that pre-modern states were much worse from the values that most of us have. And if you're a realist at all, and that's part of what Jeff and I are doing here, you don't just get to pick the perfect democratic inclusive state you would dream of. You get kind of the real alternatives that exist in the world. And the pre-modern states, they were run by people who didn't know what they were doing half the time. You have Mad Monk Rasputin, who's brought in at the end of World War I, was running the capital city while Nicholas II is out thinking he's commanding troops with his personal heroism. You have a consultation with astrologers as a kind of regular business of the state. You have the loyalists making decisions, and everything depends on which minister you get. If you get a competent minister, great. If you get a terrible one, you have total disastrous performance. Indiscriminate violence to control populations is part and parcel of the pre-modern state. Violence is the state. Max Weber gave us this definition. And if you don't control it, you end up using it in ways that are really difficult to predict and which are really, really brutal. And we can't imagine these pre-modern states taking on the challenges of the 21st century we wrote last year, such as public health challenges, climate change, food safety. And we sort of don't realize that, at least the public doesn't fully understand that these are all state functions that come out of modernity. We think some of this got missed because of with all respect to our colleagues who we've talked a lot with, so I think we're okay, actually. But we argue that the debate about democracy, as important as it is, and we'll get back to it today, we focus so much on a kind of binary of democracy and authoritarianism. The big data sets in social science all measure regime change very much along that line. And many scholars today, if you ask them about what a regime is, they'll immediately respond democracy or authoritarianism. There's no other kind of definition of regime out there. But that, of course, is a fairly new way of thinking about regimes. The idea that the entire world is divisible into two types with a range in between, we think is a product of post-World War II US hegemony. It's when we kind of set up the world system to think through modernization lenses that the world would emerge more and more democratic over time, and we could measure that progress and come up with quantitative measures. It's very useful to do that, but what we're measuring there, we think, is mostly how leaders come to power and not how they carry it out. We're measuring whether there are elections, whether they're free and fair, whether there's freedom of media and the like. But we're not asking the question, once someone comes to power, either democratically or through autocratic means, what exactly are they doing in implementing state policy? And here we went back to the great German sociologist Max Weber. This is what we all learned at Berkeley, is that we don't know what the question is, but the answer is Max Weber. I actually borrowed that joke from Jeff. So what Weber got right that's so unusual and so remarkable is that authority relations aren't at first about state and society. It does become about that. But in the first instance, if you're building a state, the relationship is of the ruler and the staff, the people who have to carry out an order or don't. And creating these bonds between leaders and staffs has to be done in a way that builds stability at the core of the state. You can only do that if people who are staff, who are obedient people think they have a duty to obey and not just a self-interest in doing so. If the whole thing is built on coercion and payoffs, it will be fragile. If, on the other hand, you can get people to believe one of three things: either that the ruler has a traditional right from history, from time immemorial, to give the order, and therefore you have a duty to obey it to protect tradition, or the ruler is a charismatic hero who represents a force beyond all possibility, who represents God on earth, or revolutionary principles and the like. Or finally, the ruler has a jurisdictional reason to give the order within a legal framework which is time-bound and space-bound, and that's, so-called rational legal authority. For most of human history, states were built up on the first two principles, personal devotion, personal loyalty. And that's one of the reasons why pre-modern states were run by cronies and loyalists, because those are the people who would have those kinds of reasons to obey. In the purest form, patrimonialism, as the name implies, is ruled by the family and friends of the leader, by the good father, which is the patra part. And if that's right, we think, this is not in the book, by the way, this was it's our Harvard slide. You can actually do a 2x2 chart because there's two different dimensions and they don't all vary together. I mean, you do have democratic, bureaucratic countries like Canada and Denmark, which, you can aspire to. But you also have autocratic, bureaucratic states. Singapore has a patrimonial family running it, but the state itself and the bureaucracy is quite rational, legal, and not corrupt. Kaiserreich Germany famously created the Rechtsstaat and, gave us that whole kind of model of what a bureaucracy should look like, which Weber then wrote about. And you also have patrimonial democracies. You have places like Philippines is a great example, where the election is between the Marcos clan and the Duterte clan, and, it's still a free and fair competitive election, even if afterward one goes to the International Criminal Court. We think that MAGA US actually fits in that category. It's Trump for now, and we'll see how long it lasts. But in the short run, it's a democratic patrimonial state. And of course, that could erode. And of course, there are plain old autocratic patrimonial states: Putin's Russia, Turkey, Hungary, and maybe China under Xi Jinping as Leninism decays into a kind of personalistic autocracy. I've got 2 more slides I'll do in 2 minutes. So we think if the right way to understand what's hit the world in the last 10 years or so is a wave of patrimonial regimes, which is the kind of thesis of the book, we're arguing something a little different from the standard literature on so-called authoritarian populism. We don't use that word. We think it's sometimes not very accurate to characterize the Trumps of the world as populist, because they're really much more rulers of the family dynasty than they are people concerned with appealing to the little guy. But we do buy the demand side equation here. So we think that people did get upset at modern states because of failures of neoliberalism, rising inequality, changing demography. The demand out there did spread through the world for the reasons lots of scholars have figured out. But the supply side, we think, hasn't been analyzed as carefully. And that's what this state building based on personal loyalty and the good father does. It provides a solution to the question, what other state can you build if you no longer trust modern states and you no longer trust so-called neoliberalism? No, we're not using the term neo-patrimonialism, as was done for scholars who looked at places like Africa or Latin America in the period of transition out of tradition into modernity. We think this is just the plain old article patrimonialism of the sort Weber described. It's just made a comeback around the world, and that was surprising to social scientists. They didn't expect it. And we think that this really emerged in Russia, and I'll explain why in 30 seconds. So we think Russia was the starting point. We've gotten a lot of debate about it. We'll see what people think. But the reason for that is that Russia under Putin was the first new patrimonial state to show you could build state power on the basis of loyalism, traditional values, anti-LGBT rights was a part of the formula everywhere, and actually do it, project power into the world, rebuild a military. I'm not saying Russia has a perfect state. Patrimonial states are corrupted and weakened in all sorts of ways. But Russia in the 2010s was way more powerful than people had predicted. We had written off Russia mostly as a kind of leftover place no one cared about anymore. Russia is finished, said The Atlantic in 2001. And those on the right who started to see how Putin was building a traditional imperial czarist empire and doing it with some social support began to take notice and say, it's not just enough to be anti-neoliberal. We can actually build a new kind of state that can then be a model for places elsewhere. And that brings us to Jeff.
So first, thanks so much. And I have to say, the really important thing is not that you read our book, but that you buy our book. My 91-year-old father told me to tell you that. He never went to college. So once you have this patrimonial state built in Russia, what happens? Well, you have this strange thing that rather than the kind of diffusion of democracy from the west to the east, you get this strange diffusion of patrimonialism. And it's not perfect, and we don't really want to make a perfect measurable diffusion argument here. But from the east to the west, it's of course much easier to export this model to places closer to home, to Belarus, right? And if you want to look at the perfect model that what Putin wants, it's the relationship with Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, former collective farm chairman. Chechnya, where Kadyrov, the president of Chechnya, feeds his opponents to tigers. It's a kind of out of James Bond, really. Places with weak bureaucratic state traditions. It's relatively easy to export that model. Well, what about Ukraine? The deal with Ukraine is what Putin wanted was not to create a new Soviet Union. He wanted nothing more than the relationship he has with Alexander Lukashenko. And Zelensky wouldn't take the deal. The Ukrainians would not take the deal. And at that moment, and I'm going to return to this in a minute or two, Putin decided to enforce what was happening in all the other countries around him there. And that is really the origins in 2014 to begin with, and then in 2022 when the Russian full-on open attack. What about the rest of Europe and, of course, the United States? So ironically, then, it starts in Orban's Hungary. I want to say a couple of things about Orban. First of all, right after 1989, what Hungary wanted more than anything in the world, it's this grand irony of history, is they regain their sovereignty and then they run as fast as they can to Brussels to hand it over, right? And what is EU enlargement after all? EU enlargement, at the end of the day, is a state-building project. Right? The entire process of getting into the EU was receiving advisors from the EU into your own ministries, telling you how you should actually run things. And the EU itself is a giant regulatory regime where everything is regulated, from pollution to labor to the transportation of geese. I mean, everything is really regulated within the EU. And the irony is what Orban then starts to do is to deconstruct it all the while taking in money and building his own little patrimonial regime. Anti-gender ideology. Within patrimonialism, there's a huge gendered component of this, which we touch on in the book, but I don't think we really make as much as we could or should. And then ironically, this patrimonialism then starts sloshing back and forth across the Atlantic. As many of you know, the Conservative Political Action Conference holds its meeting. The American Conservative Political Action Conference holds its meeting in Budapest, where the big man himself speaks, where Orban speaks, and then holds the next meeting is in Dallas, where Orban comes again to speak. And so within the new East European accession countries, Hungary became the model. And if you saw the debates, the debates this summer with Harris and Trump, when Harris criticized them for saying you don't have any respect abroad, Trump said, I do too. Viktor Orban. Then it moves strangely to Israel. And I teach every year, I've taught every year at the Hebrew University. I've spent a lot of time in Israel. The strange thing about Netanyahu, which most people don't realize, is that stream of Israeli politics, the Likud stream, and I'm going to put aside questions of Arab-Jewish relations for just 1 second, as hard as that is. That party historically, the Likud party, was the more rule of law party. The corrupt party historically in Israel was always labor. They viewed themselves as constitutionalists. They viewed themselves as liberals. They always wore ties. They viewed themselves as kind of, Jabotinsky thought of himself as the Israeli Mazzini, right? Coming out of that tradition of European liberalism. And it really was not until 2009 or even 2015 that Netanyahu departs from the dominant institutionalism of his party. Even when Menachem Begin, there's a lot of older people in here, so I know you'll know who Menachem Begin was. When he came to power, he left all the institutions in place, the civil service that had been built up. After 2015, Netanyahu starts attacking the core of the Israeli state, right? The police, the civil service, and of course, most recently, the judiciary. I'm going to skip over Johnson because Steve just said that Johnson, in his struggle against the EU for Brexit, starts attacking Brussels at the deep state. And then we get to the US under Trump. And I'm not going to focus too much on it because everybody, just as we all had to be Sovietologists during the Cold War and we all had to be public health experts during COVID, now everybody's an expert on the United States. But the one thing in the book I think we're sort of proud of is we didn't know we didn't ever heard of Project 2025 when we wrote the book, right? We just thought something like it would happen. Now, Schedule F had been put out at the end of the first Trump administration. So there was a sort of playbook, but this becomes, right, the core of what appears to be Trump's second term. And it was in the news again today. The Supreme Court just declared that he's allowed to fire these 17,000 probationary employees. So the core of what we see going on here is not simply an assault on democracy, but assault on the modern state itself. So what do we do about all this? So number one, we try to, and this we took from How Democracies Die, actually, because he had this very nice page with these great bullet points. And we thought, what are the three things we're trying to say here? What should you look for? The first thing is the promotion of the leader's extended household, family, cronies, sycophants, the positions of state power. I think we saw that in the first term. We're certainly seeing it again now, especially at the level of competence. We're seeing it. You see concerted attacks on state officials and the judiciary as unelected bureaucrats, right? Think about the assault on federal district judges as being in league with shadowy forces. On this slide, you could have a whole project on Soros, right? If you look on the Fox News website and put in Soros Fox News, there are so many stories on Fox News on Soros, they have their own page for it, right? Literally hundreds of stories. And finally, the subordination of experts and institutions of higher education. And that's really what's going on now, right? The whole notion of expertise. We're not the first ones to mention. Tom Nichols wrote a whole book on this, right? But the assault on higher education, not simply because there are experts, but because the experts might criticize the insights of the great leader. Whether it's the head of public health sitting next to the president while he tells us to insert bleach into our veins, or how planes should be flown or constructed. Now, there's a part in here that we just touch on in the book, but it's worth mentioning, in that there's a certain kind of patrimonial foreign policy, and we refer to that as the problem of fuzzy borders. As patrimonialism becomes assaulted, the rational legal demarcations of borders are seen as unreflective of the state's true patrimony. Right? Borders are no longer seen as as legal, but as historical. This is, of course, Putin's view of Ukraine. If you've read any of his speeches, especially the speech given in 2022 on the eve of the invasion, Ukraine is not a real country that was created by Lenin and Stalin, and really can only realize its true nature as part of Russia. If you speak Russian, right, this whole distinction between v Ukrainie and na Ukrainie, right, meaning, sort of on the frontier, right? That's what that means in Russian, on the frontier. And of course, Netanyahu's view of Israel as comprising, and it's one of the issues in Israel, right? And even people in the center of Israeli politics will acknowledge this, that Israel doesn't really have borders. Right? There are no well-defined borders. And the whole notion of calling the territories, the West Bank, as Judea and Samaria, which implies, of course, it's very interesting, of course, because 2 minutes, I'll be done. It's very interesting because if you're interested in the actual historical borders, the actual historical Israel, is the West Bank. Where Israel actually is now mostly on the coastal plain is not historically part of Israel, right? And so they've sort of switched things around a little bit, but it doesn't really matter. And then you have the place where all of us are going to be digging for strategic minerals when we're picked up to be put in Don Jr.'s private gulag, and that is Greenland, right? My second home and native land, Canada, is now called the 51st state. There are maps out there, which you can see, that showing where I was born in Ontario is no longer part of Canada, Panama, and of course, even Maragaza. The danger. Well, as Steve said it, we rely on the modern state. I'm going to summarize. We rely on the modern state. What would our world be like without it? Our air would be disgusting. I went to high school in California in the 80s. The air was still disgusting back then. Our water would be unclean. Our food would be poisonous. Our teachers would be quacks. Our money would be insecure. And none of us would have vaccines. The state came about historically by accrual in steps. The people on this panel have all written about that. That's where we learned it from. And there's no guarantee that once we deconstruct it, the conditions that allowed it to be constructed in the first place will allow it to be reconstructed. And right now we're in the demolition phase. What will happen next? Well, if our argument follows, the state's not going to go away. It will be repopulated. It will be repopulated with the friends and family and the quacks and the soothsayers looking for impure foreigners or people with naturalization papers. There's no guarantee that just because we want it, we'll get it back. I'm going to skip to the end. Do we care about democracy? Yes, we care about democracy. Democracy itself, the free and fair election, which I realize is not the be-all and end-all of democracy, but it is certainly the core institution. Running a free and fair election requires an administration. It's an act of the state. And if you don't have a state, you can't even hold a free and fair election. Now, it can coexist for a long time uneasily. The Philippines example shows that. But at the end of the day, what we'll see is really, we predict two things. One is an under-provision of public goods over time, which will lead to an erosion of services. Our airports, everything will start to look like LAX. I live in California, I live near, that's what I fly out of. Everything will look like LAX. Or there'll be another COVID. And we don't know what that's going to be. The state is a hedge against catastrophe. And we need those people. And when we need them, we may not be able to get them. And that's the true danger. So yes, we're very much pro-democracy, but we're deeply worried. The book's a bit of a downer, I'll grant you that, about the future of the state. So thank you very much.
Okay, so Theda Scotchbowl, thank you.
Hi. This is a brilliant and blood-curdling book, and I urge everyone to not just buy it, but read it. In fact, read it even if you can't buy it. That's even better.
Steal it.
I read it this weekend along with watching The Apprentice, not the TV show, but the movie about the young Donald Trump and his tutelage by Roy Cohn. And wow, you're lucky I'm here after that combination. Now, I approached this book not in my bringing the state back in incarnation or my States and Social Revolution incarnation, but right now as someone who's spent the last few years trying to understand what's happening to the American right and to American politics. And I spent last summer writing a Madison lecture for the American Political Science Association that was very much focused on trying to understand whether the U.S. Republican Party had made a transition from a conservative party trying to manipulate the constitutional advantages of an electoral college into a truly authoritarian project, And I concluded that it had done so and that it was a combination of top-down and bottom-up forces that had brought that about. All of which I think is important above and beyond Donald Trump, because many of the things that Donald Trump was able to use to win the nomination of the Republican Party in 2016 and win the presidency the first time were in place before. The argument in brief was that a combination of organized multi-billionaires, and I think much more organized than what we have now, in the Koch network had created a parallel party outside the Republican Party, had used a combination of continuous lobbying, deployment of money, but parallel organization to turn Republican Party candidates and elected office holders into carriers of their vision of weakening the state as a redistributive and regulatory mechanism. But they didn't want to weaken it in other respects. They simply wanted to change the policies that were and pretty much would not be pursued. But that was very unsatisfying to many Americans who were experiencing a changing industrial economy and something which is not talked about in their book very much, which is immigration. And I believe immigration, which has surged since 1965 in the United States, and every time in U.S. history immigration from new parts of the world surges, we have at the end of that period a huge nativist backlash and opportunities for nativist politicians. That popular upsurge, partly expressed through the Tea Party, changed the Republican Party, particularly in the House of Representatives, and did the rest of the hollowing out of the party as an organization able to balance different tendencies and make compromises that are necessary for governance in the United States. Part of that was hatred of bureaucrats that was stoked up, particularly by the right-wing media, which I think we do have to understand played quite an important role in all of this. It was into that dual hollowing out and weakening of the Republican Party as a set of organizations able to govern, compromise, and make bargains among different interests, which U.S. parties have to be able to do, that Donald Trump came. And I think Trump, one, can be understood in the patrimonial framework that is being offered in this book, partly because the man himself is just obsessed with who's personally loyal to him, who's personally useful to him. He's a psychologically damaged person, he's a cruel person, he's a manipulative person, and he's a person who's learned, I think, frankly, and this is going to seem prejudicial, but New York. I grew up in the Midwest, and I really have never liked New York. And I think there's something about New York real estate politics and New York politics and New York political corruption on the Democratic side, the unwillingness to ever take him to court and stick with it. And sure, there were threats and inducements. That's the Roy Cohn part of this, and Trump learned that worked. But he brought a certain kind of personal style that very much fits the patrimonial argument. He's right up there with the great patrimonial monarchs and emperors of the past, but he was operating in a context in which the Republican Party had been hollowed out, and he could push them aside. They grumbled a bit, and then create, once in the presidency, what I called a call and response system between his use of social media and his increasingly loyal followers, including many Christian nationalist-minded people who literally see him by now as an incarnation of God on earth. They originally thought he was God's instrument. They've skipped that part now. And I think that was very important for his ability to bully the Republican Party, as in Orban's Hungary. The taking over the party is the first step, to neuter them, to make them unwilling to use the levers. But I do think we need to understand that there was another strand that went into this, and I don't know that it fits this framework, although it enables it, especially in Trump 2. And that's what I call McConnellism in the paper. Mitch McConnell's determination to stretch every rule of the way Congress operates to install the Federalist Society in the judiciary. Because the judiciary is a truly Leninist small L branch of American government. If it is controlled by the determined ideologues, it will justify everything and anything, and it is doing so. There's no point in expecting them to stop. I don't believe they will. So that's all just by way of saying where I'm coming from in thinking of this. I think this book now helps us to understand why Trump 2 is quite different from Trump 1. It's that the man has arrived in office with a series of forces around him who are not just sycophants or incompetents, they are selected for intense personal loyalty, almost in a feudal way. I mean, think of feudal Europe. I mean, it has a lot of that quality. And they moved very, very quickly to turn the Justice Department and the military into personal instruments that will do anything. They are moving very quickly to destroy large parts of the government. And that's a question I have for our two authors, because I do think there's a techno-authoritarianism that's coming into this, which I would also treat as a somewhat separate but coincidentally synergistic element. Elon Musk and the tech bros, they have an image of a post-state world controlled by brilliant people like them, in which we're all signed up on a website where we get everything we need. We've all cooperated quite a bit with that. I get everything I need from Amazon. I mean, I'm still doing it, even though I know better. So I think that you have to have that in there, too, to understand why they're not just trying to put instruments of government in the hands of loyalists who will use them to further Trump's personal desires, which change quite often, so it's tricky. But why they're actually destroying large parts. Why put RFK in charge of public health in the United States? It's crazy. In some ways, it's the craziest of these things. And I don't know whether patrimonial loyalty is quite enough there, maybe envy of the Kennedys, because when you have the patrimonial figure, whatever his psychological problems are, become the problems. And so we have to get some of these specifics. But let me move on quickly because I don't want to take too long. I think this book helps us understand why Trump's second victory was so disorienting and why so much has moved so quickly with the destruction of state organizations, not just their perversion. It's very important to just clear the way for a whole series of feudal-style personal networks in these places. It certainly also helps us understand why a purely electoral response is not going to be enough. So much damage is being done to core institutions of government that perform crucial but not very visible functions, certainly public health, national defense. Running fair elections will be part of it. That a mere victory by the Democrats in the 2026 elections is not going to be enough to change much. Might even speed it up if the usual deadlock ensues. I think it also helps us understand, and there's a lot in the book about a critique of populist responses to the rise of either authoritarianism or patrimonial rule, which either of the sets of authors here. I hadn't realized that Michael Sandel was proposing a lottery for getting into universities. That's bananas. Let me just say that. There's nothing communitarian about that. And a lot of the left, of which I am broadly a part, does believe that more people in the streets, more pushing from below is going to be sufficient to respond to this. And this book makes it very clear why playing into a left anti-institutionalism would actually further empower. Just as I believe that much has happened in the universities in the last 15 years of privileging the feelings of certain categories of students over others, made it impossible for university administrators to recognize a moment in which the victims included others after October 7th. And it's disorienting. So, I mean, there's a lot about this book that should make us all think about what is going to be needed to deal with what's unfolding and will keep unfolding for the next 4 years. And here are my conclusions. I think this underlines the importance of demanding coordinated action by civil society elites. Think laterally, don't think up and down. Turn the TV off when Trump comes on. Stop paying attention to Donald Trump. He's a known quality. The Republican Party is currently hopeless. It's important for media figures, when one of them is excluded from the White House, they should all leave. When one law firm is subverted, they should all say, tough, we're banding together to push back. And if the big ones won't do it, I gather they mostly do mergers and acquisitions, and I'm not sure in this tariff regime how many mergers and acquisitions they're going to have to do, then the medium size and the little ones should band together. And I think that's happening. I think that's beginning to happen. Universities. Has the Harvard Corporation said anything? Okay, they're trying the hide and hope it goes away approach. That's not going to work. Now, I'm not recommending anything wild. You guys may have noticed that I've become more conservative in my old age, and I have. I'm quite cautious, and I'm not signing any group letters because I have a policy against it. But I have been urging university authorities to contact the people in the other universities, to talk through scenarios, to be prepared to know where you're going to draw the line and what you're going to do, and how you're going to marshal your resources to make up for what they will take away for a while. Because if everybody does this, or most people do in these elite civil society categories, they don't have the capacity to enforce the carrots and sticks regime that they're trying to do. You can't both destroy the state and use it. And the final thing I'll say is that I follow along that America has a chance to come through this and rebuild because we're a federal polity. And we need to remember that. We are fortunate to live in Massachusetts. It's not a perfect place, and there's a lot of Democratic Party corruption here. Not as much as Illinois, but there's a lot. Not as much as New York even. But the liberal states and the purple states do have state capacity. They can and are hiring a lot of people being fired by the federal government. They better hire the public health experts because we're going to need them. I think the next pandemic will come soon. And once we get through this period, that kind of state capacity and good governance capacity and rethinking of the Democratic Party that Wisconsin has done some of already, that will be able to be drawn on to rebuild a new kind of national government in the United States. I'm not going to talk about the U.S. and the world. I think that's over. But I think the U.S. imperium was coming to an end already. And I think this just speeds it up. But I do think the United States can emerge as what I would call a state-society synergy, drawing on the work of my colleague Peter Evans, in which we have healthy civil society institutions nurturing and interacting with not totally authoritative bureaucracies, we've never had that, but with enough expertise so that we can pursue the public good. And I think that states and compacts of states that aren't part of this are a very crucial part of resisting and surviving it and rebuilding after it's over. So,
Thank you. And now, Steve Levitsky.
Note to self, never follow Theta Scotch Bowl as a discussant. First of all, I'm from New York. Come on, man.
There are some good elements, especially when they come to Harvard.
This is a, let me just echo Theda in saying this is a really, really important book. It's also an incredibly Berkeley book. Reading it, among many other things, reminded me of the value of my Berkeley education. Berkeley is all over this book. I think the book makes two huge contributions. Let me highlight them first and then quibble on some much smaller things. First of all, if I can coin a phrase coined by my colleague Theda, it brings the state back in. Not to comparative politics, as Theda and her colleagues did 40 years ago, but to public debate in the United States. Americans have never paid enough attention to the state, but our inattention to the state has, as Steve and Jeff already pointed out, has reached a crisis point in recent years, and particularly during this current administration's attack on the state. The book was conceived of and written well before Doge, but it anticipates it perfectly. Elon Musk is breaking the U.S. state day by day as we watch, and many Americans neither understand nor appreciate it, at least those who haven't read your book yet. And in part, that's because we as a society have failed to understand and appreciate the role of the state, what the state provides in terms of basic public goods, what the state provides in terms of regulation and essential services, how the state undergirds a capitalist economy, the many, many ways that the state makes all of our lives better. Americans don't appreciate the state in part because nobody in our political system talks about it. Nobody in our political system defends it. As Steve and Jeff show in the book, we have a bunch of different strains of libertarian and ultra-libertarian thought attacking the state, attacking it as useless, as corrupt, as hopelessly inefficient, and very few, remarkably few, political leaders standing up and defending it. So many Americans are pretty ignorant, remain pretty ignorant to this day, of what their lives would be like if we actually break the state. Unfortunately, they may find out. So this book reminds us of the value of a Weberian state, of the importance of a civil service, of the importance of expertise. Again, comparativists don't need to be told that, but the U.S. establishment and the American public do. And unfortunately, it may take 4 years of Pete Hegseth and Kash Patel and RFK Jr. to get that message through to the American public. But in short, there are really, honestly, few messages more important in the United States today than the value of the state, of a Weberian state. So that is one major contribution. Second contribution of the book is that it introduces us to the concept of patrimonialism. Those of us who study Latin America don't need an introduction to the concept, but Americans do, because this is somewhat new. It's not entirely new, of course, but it's been decades. It has been decades since we had anything remotely resembling patrimonialism in the United States. And even back then, it was primarily subnational. Trump is distinctive in U.S. politics in many respects. He is more populist, he is more authoritarian, but he's also far more patrimonial. And I think Steve and Jeff are absolutely right about this. Trump has an approach to governing that differs radically from just about every other U.S. politician. He approaches the state in the same way that Somoza, Trujillo, Du Bois approached it, as an instrument for his own personal use. That has done an extraordinary amount of harm, but Americans, at least first, didn't quite know how to interpret that. Trump's approach to governing is, in fact, patrimonial. I think Hansen and Kopstein do an enormous job in helping the U.S. establishment name it. They're helping to make Trump's behavior much more legible, and I think that's really, really important. Let me make three pretty mild critical points, because I guess that's sort of my job. The first is conceptual, and Theda started down this road. I want to push down a little further. There are many ways to attack and destroy a Weberian state. You can personalize or patrimonialize it, if that's a word. That's what Trump is doing. You can politicize and weaponize it the way that Orban and DeSantis and Project 2025 seek to do, or you can break it, like Musk is trying to do. And there's obviously some overlap among these three, but they're not the same, and they're not all necessarily patrimonialism. Patrimonialism, as you guys point out very clearly, has a core element of personalism to it. The state becomes the personal instrument of the ruler. That's Trump for sure. But many cases of politicization and weaponization of the state, including across the world today, are led by parties or ideological movements. So what Law and Justice did in Poland, what the AKP, the BJP, even to some extent Fidesz are doing, these are partisan projects. An entire party or movement shares an ideology about the need to purge and pack some version of a deep state. And it's the same thing, I think, with Project 2025 and MAGA. These guys have been, and down to the rank and file, activists, thousands of them, have embraced an ideology that says that public and private institutions in the United States have been captured by Marxist ideologues and need to be purged, packed, and deployed against the bad guys. That's what DeSantis has been doing in Florida. That's politicization. It is weaponization of the state. But I think it goes well beyond personalism or the power of a single leader. And to call that patrimonialism, all of it patrimonialism, I think risks stretching the concept. Secondly, and inevitably I'm going to come back to a defense of regime scholars, of course, I was somewhat confused by Chapter 3's discussion of regimes and states. I get and agree with, and I'm persuaded by the basic point that authoritarianism has gotten a lot of attention in recent years and we've largely ignored patrimonialism. Agree. I could be persuaded that our attention to the democracy authoritarianism debate has blinded us, to use your language, to the dimension of patrimonialism. Yeah, okay. But I don't understand the claim that we're somehow measuring democracy wrong. And this is more of an implicit than explicit claim. So the question is, so I get that you're pointing to the problem of inattention. I'm in on that. Is this a conceptual critique as well? Are regime scholars getting it wrong in our analyses of Hungary, of India, the United States? Is our conceptualization and operationalization of democracy ill-defined? Are we getting the indicators wrong? When Danny and I write that the United States is sliding into authoritarianism, are we getting that wrong because it's really patrimonialism? I don't see why it's necessarily one or the other. It's clearly both, as you guys just pointed out in the presentation. So scholars like Guillermo O'Donnell and Sebastian Masuka, another Berkeley grad, have made a pretty compelling case that regime and state are best treated as two distinct dimensions, and that it's very important not to conflate the two. And you guys put that up in a slide, right? You can have Weberian dictatorships like Singapore. You can have patrimonial democracies like Benin, Philippines, Dominican Republic in the late 20th, early 20th century. Not Brazil, by the way. Not a patrimonial democracy. So state and regime are two distinct dimensions, both of which have to be taken seriously. But Chapter 3 creeps up to the point of saying, you guys are all wrong. It's not authoritarianism. It's actually patrimonialism. And I think that's not right. It can be authoritarianism and patrimonialism, and we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So I don't see what the war's about. Finally, from a comparative politics standpoint, not entirely sure this is so new, and I'm not entirely convinced yet that we're seeing a wave of patrimonialism. I'm not sure the claim holds up under comparative scrutiny. Russia and the United States are experiencing waves of patrimonialism. You've convinced me about that. But this is ultimately a very US and Russia story. And I think in other regions of the world, the pattern is at least somewhat different. Patrimonialism, of course, is not new in Africa and the Middle East and Latin America. And in fact, with a handful of exceptions, important exceptions, those regions, Africa, Middle East, Latin America, much of Southeast Asia, have become less patrimonial and are less patrimonial today than they were 40 or 50 years ago. Countries like Senegal, Benin, Ghana, Malawi, Tanzania, Kenya are certainly less patrimonial than they were back in the 1970s. They are not Finland. but they built more effective states. In Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, Dominican Republic are all much more Weberian today than they were half a century ago. Again, not Finland, not Singapore, but not where they were in the 1970s. The book mentions Bolsonaro and Brazil. Brazil has a far less patrimonial state than it did in the 1980s, which is one of the reasons why Bolsonaro failed and is probably heading to prison. In Asia, Vietnam, Laos, Malaysia, Indonesia, even the Philippines have developed stronger, not weaker bureaucracies over the last 40 years. Again, none of these cases meet the Weberian ideal type, but if there is a pattern, and maybe there isn't, but if there's a pattern in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia over the last 40 years, it's at least mildly in the direction of less patrimonial rather than more patrimonial states. So this combination, you made an interesting claim about the combination of the coexistence of patrimonialism and democracy and how ultimately it may erode democracy in the United States. And I think that's probably right, but there's at least some evidence that when you combine the two in the global South, democracy has actually chipped away somewhat at patrimonialism. I think Brazil is a closer case of that. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So we're gonna open it up for questions. I already see hands up, but would you guys like to have one response? I mean, one thing I would ask, and maybe you can think about this, is given what Steve, if you accept some of what Steve's critique that there are places in the world where patrimonialism has eroded, then there's this great, and if Steve's right, then there's this incredible puzzle. Why is it that the United States has experienced this? And why is it Russia? I mean, these are two very dissimilar countries in many respects, right? So why is it that patrimonialism has taken off in these two places of all places, if there's not truly a global wave? So I don't know if you guys want to have some immediate responses, or should we collect questions first? I'll leave it up to you.
Either way, but you can go ahead, because I'll deal with one of Theta's.
All right, we'll do it quick.
Yes.
We had to do it quick.
Yeah, then we have 30 minutes now for discussion, so I'm eager to get everybody's input.
I mean,
Very quickly.
I think there's a couple conclusions from these excellent comments. First of all, thank you so much for your wonderful feedback, and it's really stuff to keep thinking through. The first conclusion is don't put a 2x2 chart in the presentation that's not in the book, because then you actually end up with more problems. I think in a way we are scholars of the global north and there's a problem there, but it may not be as deep a problem as it could be, and I'll explain why. So the shock, right, is the spread of patrimonialism in countries and we think UK under Johnson was heading this direction. And we do include, Hungary, and we do include Israel. So there is a diffusion process happening in well-developed countries we didn't expect. I think it's completely plausible, as you say, Steve, that in the global south, the process of state building has actually gone well relative to where it was, and that trajectory was possibly going to continue. But I worry a lot that a global system in which the major powers of the world have embraced patrimonial governance is not one conducive to further progress along those lines in the global south. Brazil is a remarkable case of pushback where the judiciary remained independent and Bolsonaro and Lula is a bit different, and so I understand that critique. But will we have a world in which kind of support for depatrimonialization in places like Kenya or elsewhere going to continue when the major powers of the world have given up on this ideal? I have my doubts, so that would be my quick response.
So my very quick response, it's not going to be to Steve, it's something that Theta said, and that is because the book is such a downer, and Theta raised the possibility, okay, so what to do about this? And he raised a super interesting possibility of federalism being one of the answers. Now, you mentioned New York, Massachusetts, but I'd like to mention California, right, where I'm from. And there was a very interesting thing that happened right at the beginning of Trump's first term, when Trump threatened not to allow the use of satellite technology to look at climate change and the effect on fires. You know what Jerry Brown's response was? We'll build our own damn satellites, right? California does have that capacity, this pre-existing state capacity that Daniel talked about in his first book, being about how you can have federalism. You need to have that pre-existing capacity. I wrote a memo to our chancellor, it's the equivalent of the president. No one, I don't think anybody's ever read it. So it's basically saying that shouldn't this be passed up the line? If they're going to take away the indirect cost recovery from the grants, shouldn't there be a California Science Foundation? I mean, we have the population of a country. How about a consortium of states right, in order to, resist. I don't know if that's the right word.
Well, we have consortia that have addressed environmental things since the Republican Party opted out of that.
Absolutely, to preserve existing state, because so much of state capacity in the United States is at the state level. Why not just get really serious about it? I mean, there are other things that were said, but I'd rather turn it over to the audience.
Great, thank you. So, we have questions up, and anybody else would like to add their name to the queue, please add your name, raise your hand. And when you, before you ask your question, please say your name. So the first person I saw was Mark. So say who you are, your name, where your affiliation.
I will do. My name is Mark. I'm a first-year PhD student at the government department here at Harvard in political science. So I have 2 points on the COVID motivation and the diffusion argument. On the COVID motivation, yes, you say countries as diverse as the UK and the US, they were against the state, but there were a bunch of countries that had a concentrated policy and that succeeded, right? And I don't quite agree with this the UK turning into a patrimonial state. The UK also, they changed the government and then they did something else. On the diffusion story, I think that so there's a huge appeal to this, and if there's anything that feels meaningful to do as a political scientist in this moment is to think about this question, right? But on the diffusion argument, it doesn't resonate so well for me. So in the UK and the US, you sort of have a long ideological tradition of state skepticism, right? Thatcher in the UK and in the US, the Reagan movement, and of course those nurtured each other's. And there's something for me where you have this latent ideology in both countries, where then the puzzle is in the US that you have some people who want small state, and then also some people who take the property rights away from the small state thing. But I think I would be more appealed by this sort of historical within unit country than a diffusion who in America pays attention to what happens in Hungary, right?
The Republicans do.
The Republican
Well,
Party.
now Trump certainly does.
Oh, yeah, they have an entire apparatus.
And just, sorry. And it is on the COVID thing, so it sounds almost exogenous, so these countries were doing fine, and then exogenously this diffusion comes. But how about how the state performed? In some of these countries, the state didn't do so well, and people were not happy about that. And maybe they were more swayable to people who said, the state is doing very poorly. And in other countries, the state did all right, and its health is okay now.
Great. Maybe we'll collect a couple of questions. Those are good questions. I mean, I would just add to this point, though, what's at stake in this diffusion story? I mean, why is it important that we agree on that or not? I mean, whether or not one agrees on it. Danielle. Yeah.
Thank you. Daniela Schwarzer, Bertelsmann Foundation Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center and Professor of Political Science in Berlin. I have one remark, which is really interesting. You may want to look into that. Right now in Germany, we have a debate on the reform of the state, which I have never seen in that way. And I think it is an answer to a tendency, which we also have in our country, which is questioning not only the European Union and challenging it very much on the way you described it, but also the federal state. And so there's a preemptive discussion right now, which may lead to some reforms which can have the state deliver in a better way than it does at the moment, which would respond in part to the point previously made. My question is, so I see a lot of patterns which I would subscribe to that you have outlined, but my question is, do you see patterns in the conditions that have to be in place for this patrimonial shift to happen and to be supported by voters? So what are the conditions for this to happen? And it's not only voters, I think it's also a change of how domestic political spheres work, the role of social media, and the possibility of possibly future patrimonial leaders to change narratives while they are running their campaigns. So my question would be that those domestic conditions that you think need to be put in place to succeed.
Can we start with
Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Go ahead.
So this gets at both something that Steve said and that was discussed about. Steve brought up the point was, are we actually talking about patrimonialism? Aren't some of the cases we're talking about actually about ideology more? And we have this argument in the book, says, look, within the United States, there are these three seemingly disconnected but seemingly disconnected and separate streams, sources of support, right, for the Trump coalition, if you will. Right? In the first place, it was already discussed, libertarianism, right? And this is a much older tendency within the United States, and the tech libertarianism, which is kind of puts that libertarianism on steroids. And then, Peter Thiel, the idea of seasteading, putting it going out to the sea or going up to the moon, and you can avoid the state that way, right? The second is Christian nationalism, right? And there, they don't like the state, not because it diminishes freedom or leads to totalitarianism, but because it's too secular. It's really the secular administrative state. And then the third tendency is really comes under these people who argue that there should be unconstrained executive power, the unitary executive theory. And what's interesting about them is that all three of them don't really agree with each other, right? You think about it for a second. If you had a really super powerful executive that was unconstrained, right? Well, that would be one thing if it was Donald Trump, but it would be another thing if it was Bernie Sanders, right? Completely unconstrained executive. They all don't get along. So when they pull the lever, they're in effect pulling separate levers. But, right, they all think they're getting something out of Trump. The fact of the matter is that none of them are going to get what they want. The libertarians are really not going to get no state. That is not going to happen. That hasn't really happened since I was a freshman at Berkeley and liked that for a week. Right? It's because you're away from home. You don't want mom and dad, and there's free dope, right? The Christian nationalists are not going to get what they want. And even the unitary executives are not going to get exactly what they want. And so at the end of the day, we think that this is a kind of, it's not that patrimonialism is at the core of any of those. It's the end result of all of those, right? And so I think that gets at a few of the questions here. We go away, we don't really approach a clear diffusion story, right? Because really, to do diffusion, the way political scientists do it, if you want to causally identify it, you need stocks and flows and all those. We avoid all that stuff. We actually want someone to read the book, right? And so this diffusion really sloshes around from place to place, right? It's interesting. In Israel, they started the whole discussion of the deep state. It really wasn't with Netanyahu. It started with other people first, right? And then, interestingly, his son used it. Right? And then other people use it, and it's just recently that Netanyahu himself has started using it, including some other things that are straight from the United States, right? And you have that in Hungary as well, too, right? And sometimes Soros fills in for the deep state, right? But it's the same idea. So, I mean, that's our little diffusion story.
Yeah, I'll add just a couple points. Kurt Wayland has got a great book which talks about diffusion as based on bounded rationality. It's the availability heuristic, which is leaders really don't understand political science, right? They're looking for some model. And I really think that's what's driving what we're seeing is people didn't understand you could build an empire of the czarist sort in the 21st century, and Putin did it. And while the rest of the world was poo-pooing Russia, conservatives were looking at Putin. I mean, it's amazing how often you talk to conservatives in the US and they'll say, he's a good man. He's a Christian, he's in favor of the traditions. It makes liberals crazy. They're like, well, what are you saying that about Putin for? The reason is that the original model was Putin. And that, by the way, is where we think the Russia-US connection comes in. It's not that, Putin deploys Trump, the agent, to ruin the American state, as tempting as that theory can be at times. It's really just a model, and people who see it start building a state with the same tropes, with the same attacks on the same kinds of administrators and judiciaries and universities, and we think that diffusion is demonstrable. You read the book, you'll see, it's step by step, chronological.
They build a state. They use one that's already quite powerful. Don't you think that's what the U.S. and Russia have in common, and that differs from some of the examples?
I mean, what we say in the book is that there is a difference implementing the patrimonial model in a very well-developed modern state. It requires a lot of deconstruction before you can do the next step. Whereas Putin didn't have that legacy to handle. It was easier, right, to build a personalistic, loyalistic bureaucracy in a place that was not functioning well at all after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But having said that, the ultimate state, and this is a bit of a prediction, so we'll see if we're right, is that you don't end up with just the destruction of the American state. You will get recruitment, and the recruitment will be on the lines of loyalty and litmus tests. And now, is it ideological? We think not, and this may be a question of how to define ideology, so there's a bit of a terminological point here. But compared to the ideological regimes of the past, the fascist, the Nazi, the Leninist regimes of the 20th century, patrimonialism, as Weber says, based on the arbitrary will of the father figure. It's part of the model that the top guy, and it's gendered, can make any decision at all on any given day because the state is his personal property. And I mean, of course, if you're strong as Hitler at some point, you can do the same. But there is an ideology behind Hitler that doesn't exist here. I mean, the leader doesn't believe in much of anything when it comes down, and Putin is the same. If Putin wants to, he can tack one way or another. He can have Dugin there, or he can kick Dugin out. It's you know, and they all understand that. So you see right now the dynamic where people like Elon Musk, people like Steve Bannon, they'll criticize other members of the coalition, but they'll never criticize the boss. Not one of them will ever say a single thing about Trump, because they understand that the rules of the game have shifted like that. So we think that's not ideological, it's personalistic, but you know, we could debate definitions.
I think I learned how to define ideology from you, Steve.
Clear and consistent definition of a future polity, so they don't have that, is the point.
Right.
Great, thank you. Stefan Collignon.
My name is Stefan Collignon, and I'm professor at the LSE and now here at the economics department. It's an extremely stimulating presentation you gave. I look forward to reading your book. And it kind of brought up a few thoughts. I wonder what you say to that. To me, what you say, how you argue, maybe because Max Weber now lives in Berkeley, I don't know. But it seems very European in its language, which is talking about the state. In England, we talk about government. And there's a difference. And what I got from what you said is that the state was first really challenged by the left in a kind of semi-anarchic challenge, democratization, weakening the administration, bureaucracy, and all that. And it didn't go very far because it's very diffuse. Now we have the state as an instrument to dismantle. We have the government as an instrument to dismantle the state. And I wonder whether that isn't an important part, because the government has the focalized instruments to dismantle the state.
Let me just get a couple more points. There's just so many hands up. Amelia.
Wait, me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Amelia. I'm a first-year PhD student in government.
So I called on you when you had something in your mouth.
Yeah, sorry.
Take your time.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship between patrimonialism and different kinds of state capacity. So I'm not reading what's happening right now as an assault uniformly on the state. It's on parts of the state, like ICE raids and arresting students. That is a particular form of state power. They're broadcasting that power. That seems pretty different from what we're seeing with, say, the IRS or laying off civil servants. And so I guess I was just wondering if you talk a little bit more about, in these patrimonial regimes, you know, it's not like ICE is personally serving Trump, so it doesn't seem like that's like a direct personal thing. That seems like it's potentially more ideological or connected to his partisan project. So I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more about those distinctions.
One more. Yes.
Myra Marks Ferry, retired sociology professor, hanging around here these days. And the question that I wanted to raise is something that you've mentioned in passing, and then said, well, you haven't paid that much attention. But I think it's important. And that's the relationship between patriarchal politics and patrimonialism. And when you're talking about, like, what is the appeal here, and what happened in Russia, and what happened in the Midwest, and what's happening in advanced liberal democracies, is that you have a gradual unmaking of certain premises of conventional patriarchal rule. Whether it's the conventional advantage of the male breadwinner over the female breadwinner, the conventional advantage of men dominating political institutions where women are first allowed to vote, then allowed to serve, then it actually looks like, gee, women could be in the judiciary, gee, women could be actual executives. And of course, that's gone a lot further in Europe and with much less contestation than it has in the US. And what we see in the US, looking at it in terms of patriarchal conventions that uphold patrimonial power or allow the expansion of patrimonial power, is that we see Putin and Orban particularly making the gender ideology argument central, drawing resources out of church networks, be they Islamic or Jewish or Christian nationalist, and those kinds of religious nationalisms, and their support for return to patriarchal convention seem to me to be a key piece of the dynamic of what makes patrimonialism look like something that will make America great again, that appeals to people who see some kind of lost greatness. And Putin plays a lot on that lost greatness. Orban plays a lot on the loss of the Hungarian Empire, lost greatness of the not just patrimonial, but patriarchal state.
Yeah, totally agree with all of that. I mean, we should mention Julia Adams at Yale, whom I'm sure you know, as an original inspirer of some of the work that we ended up doing. And we'll see her tomorrow, actually. So for those who don't know Adam's work about the Dutch East India Company and patrimonialism in early modern Europe, it really does take the gender component front and center. And so we do mention it in the book. We think that it's important. Weber himself, interestingly enough, did talk about this as well and understood that the patriarchal starting point was one of the reasons patrimonialism felt quote unquote legitimate to those who accepted its premises. So I think there's just much more that one could do with that, as Jeff said earlier, and the book was, sort of meant to reach a lot of people in a hurry, so he didn't go as deeply into it as we might have, but maybe we made a mistake because of that dimension being, it connects it to the bro culture and the kind of manosphere, as people say, in a way that maybe I hadn't seen before. I want to say just one quick thing about state performance, which I didn't say in response to the previous question. We have a couple points we make about the state performance issue. One is that a challenge for us is that patrimonial states can do well using past state capacity for a while, right? So Operation Warp Speed is a good example. I mean, you had all these great doctors that could produce a vaccine in no time. And Israel is the same. But over time, our prediction is that as this kind of loyalty is the criterion for promotion, and you destroy all the universities, you're going to have less and less of that state capacity for the next crisis. So people may have been fooled into thinking the first Trump administration was actually fine because state capacity hadn't been diminished enough. It was still a lousy response to the pandemic in comparative terms, and Putin the same. So we do also, the second point is that when you find patrimonial leaders, they do pretty poorly with these kinds of challenges. I think you can make that statistical case in terms of excess deaths, for example. I mean, Putin's response to the pandemic was to hide at the end of a very long table and let regional governors take the blame for whatever happened, while producing a vaccine that may or may not have worked, but no one trusted it in Russia, so they didn't want to get anywhere near it. And that, too, is a problem of patrimonialism, is that people no longer trust that there could be an expert bureaucracy that might produce something they actually wanted to do. On the point about ICE, first of all, there is personal loyalty there, and Trump is cultivating it very directly. So with border guards, with ICE, with people who are doing his bidding, and Pete Hegseth in the Department of Defense, Kash Patel.
The police all along.
Yeah, I mean, that's his peeps, and he's made that a kind of constant theme. So that fits, I think, what we're trying to say about the repurposing of the state. It's not that the state disappears, it becomes patrimonial. So parts of it, which are oriented toward defending the interests of the ruling household, get promoted. Those that are independent sources of expertise, autonomous civil society organizations, all of that gets crushed.
So just to deal with that question quickly, because we didn't talk, it's an important distinction. It's fascinating the way you put it. If you're interested, we don't really have time to get into it more deeply, but the genealogy of that is by way of Reinhard Bendix, right? It's Bendix who came to Berkeley in the 1930s, really. He came to Berkeley and really founded this kind of a focus on the state, right? Separate from comparative government. It was never really called that, right? It was always called comparative politics with a focus on the state. I think what you say about government being used as a weapon against the state, that's profound. I never really put it that. We didn't put it that way in our book at all. I have to think about it a lot more. I think you're onto something there, and especially it solves the issue of the way to talk about this in Great Britain, right? Which is it's not so simple to do, but I think you've given the language for doing that.
Don't you think that Trump patrimonialized the Republican Party during his first term? Now he's patrimonializing core parts of the state.
Yeah, no, undoubtedly, and
That's
including.
different.
Yes, and it's now the Trump party. I mean, there's very little that's left of what you might call the old Republican Party.
I see Britain as having resisted a little bit.
They did. Our point about Johnson, just to be clear, isn't that he succeeded in building a patrimonial regime. It's just that was his orientation. He went as far as he could. It turned out the forces arrayed against him were too powerful. So we're not predicting every patrimonial would-be ruler will always win.
The fight is on, even if it's not over, or it appears to be very far gone in the case of the United States. We're laying out what we think at least one of the important parts of the fight is. And it's not just democracy. It is also democracy. It's also, what you could really put this in very broad terms. So what we're experiencing is a kind of a demodernization, right? That's really what's going on here. And I think that helps me understand it in both sociological terms and gets you around the problem, is it democracy or the state? It's just demodernization in general. And that's something that social theory, to my knowledge, never predicted anywhere. Right? It's just nowhere in the literature at large. And, maybe we should be thinking about it that way with all the problems of thinking in terms of modernity and modernization.
Yeah, one thing I could just say here is that, so using that as a kind of starting point, of course, the problem with modernization theory was assuming that it would happen everywhere, in similar ways. And so I think, in a way, that's what your diffusion story is trying to account for, why this seems to be happening in lots of places. But I sort of would come back to the point here, why is it that, and Mark's point, why is it that the U.S. is particularly vulnerable?
Yeah.
Steve and I give a story about why American democracy is vulnerable. It has to do with the particular structure of our Constitution. Right. So why is it that the American state is more vulnerable to this?
Civil elites are given to competing with one another, they have little capacity to cooperate. Britain is different. Britain has an establishment.
Yeah.
And so you think that's an explanation?
Sloughed him off.
You have as an explanation of why patrimonialism doesn't go as far.
And it's a parliamentary system where if they mess up, you can get rid of them.
Although
that was Orban as well. So everybody was arguing that about Hungary in the 1990s. It was so wise for them to have chosen a parliamentary system. All I want to say that is, I know you agree with this. Institutions won't save you if you're bad enough.
No,
right?
No, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, we have like 7 questions left in 5 minutes, so this is sort of hopeless. But I'm going to just call on Stephen Sawyer and then Robert.
Yeah, actually, what I was going to say, Ruban, directly off what you were saying, and it was also Steve Levitsky's comment, and it's about the rise of state capacity and this decline of patrimonialism in a whole range of states. And it leads me to a sort of odd conclusion that one could draw from the way you presented this, which is that I think, broadly speaking, the social science literature, under the broad heading of what we might call neoliberalism, has been arguing we've had a decline of state capacity for 40 to 50 years since, let's say, since the late 70s or early 80s. And it seems like it would almost make more sense and would go with what Steve Levitsky was saying, that, in fact, patrimonialism arrives at the end of that process. We could easily see that with Russia. Because otherwise we end up with a story as if we've been building this massive state for the last 40 years, and now all of a sudden it's been captured in some weird way. So it just seems like the case of, it accounts for quite a few post-Soviet contexts, Soviet, obviously Russia, for what the United States has been doing, for Britain, and it would also explain why a whole series of other states in Latin America that have been building state capacity see a decline.
One last one, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Bob Kuttner, Brandeis University and the American Prospect Magazine. I wonder if we can bring the people back in. The question I have is, how can Trump dare appoint RFK Jr. to run HHS and trash CDC and trash NIH and trash other institutions that ordinary people actually value, like FEMA or like the National Park Service.
Social Security is the key one.
Social Security, without fear of losing the people. There's a line of Brecht that I often think of. It's 1953, he's living in East Berlin, he's a communist, but he's also a liberal, and a party functionary has complained that the people are insufficiently enthusiastic about the party program, and Brecht writes, wouldn't it be more efficient to fire the people and get a new one? And I guess the question is, has the support of the people for the affirmative state that does a lot of good stuff, and for democracy, become so softened up over the years, and if so, why, that you can just do this without fear of losing the people?
So unfortunately, I think we're going to have to leave it for you guys to give a sort of last round of comments, and I'm also happy to do this.
I'm going to mention the people, which is very interesting. I'm not a social movements person, but I did watch what everybody else was watching this last weekend. And one of the things I did see was among the demonstrators who were concerned about democracy, it was hands off, right? Remember, that was the slogan. Hands off what? Right? And there were a certain number of people out there, again, I'm not a social movement specialist, who were saying, hands off Social Security, hands off Medicare. What I would say is that if you're going to go out and protest, be sure what you're protesting for. What is your demand? There were a certain number of people out there, I don't know what the total numbers were, that really were talking about core state functions that they were worried about not happening anymore. It wasn't, say, hands off our civil service. I didn't see that. Right? Was it there? Oh, yeah. Okay. I mean, I was in Southern California in Santa Ana. There were 5,000 people there. I didn't see that one, but that's the sort of thing I would be looking for. Not that will solve the problem, because I agree with Theda. It has to go to the civic elites as well, especially. But I think if we're to address this problem in particular, right, the ask has to be very clear. Right? And I haven't seen gigantic signs of it yet. I've seen bits and pieces of it.
Yeah, I'll just say a word about neoliberalism, which is, we're with you. We're not huge fans of neoliberalism. We liked the old notion that the state could provide public goods and it was part of a democratic order. That was an invention of the really, 19th century, but then in the post-war era became more democratized. We didn't succeed in making it entirely inclusive or representative that could be further integrated into democracy, but it was a good thing to have a welfare state, we used to call it, before these terms became taboo. Somehow you can't say welfare state without sounding like a tax and spend liberal or a radical Marxist extremist or whatever kind of language is used. And that I do think, and this is something Theda said earlier, it really is a discursive problem for us in defending it, that we don't have language anymore to talk about the state. I think neoliberalism really has a lot to do with that. It meant that when we talked about policies toward Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you couldn't even talk about rebuilding the Russian state without sounding like you were some person wanting the nomenclatura to take over all the property in Russia anymore, again. And that wasn't the point. It was that they needed a civil service that wasn't corrupted. They needed a new judiciary. They needed institutions that were responsive. And instead, all we could tell them was how to privatize, monetize, and stabilize currency, which just wasn't really the right recipe. Even though that didn't cause the economic collapse, we didn't give messages that were hopeful about state building. So we're with you. But last point, the damage to the state we just talked about in 3 months, that clearly wasn't neoliberalism. That's Donald Trump. And the patrimonial regimes as a causal factor are definitely different and really significant. You could imagine a world in which lots of neoliberalism kind of eroded states around the world and made it harder to make the case for them without the wholesale destruction of every state institution in the country in a couple of months. So for that, we think the regime type really matters, and we think the measurement of regime probably does need a little bit of a rethink because of that, but we can talk about that over dinner.
Yeah, so I mean, and Jeff's last point also does suggest that democracy might be useful in protecting the state, right? This is how these dimensions connect to each other. Indeed. So please join me in thanking Stephen Levitsky, Theda Skocpol,